Have you ever been lying in bed, dead of night? Like, the house is completely quiet and then you hear it.
Oh, yeah. The classic bump in the night.
Right. A floorboard creaks. Or there's this soft, unexplainable thud from the other room. Or maybe a sudden shift in the air pressure that just makes the hair on your arms stand up. What do?
You freeze?
Exactly. You freeze, your breathing stops, your heart skips a beat, and then almost immediately your brain starts working overtime to rationalize it.
It desperately wants an answer.
Right. You tell yourself, oh, it's just the house settling, or it's the wind against the window, or, the temperature is dropping and the old pipes in the walls are just contracting. You feed yourself this logical, mundane explanation for the anomaly.
Yeah, you have to.
And why do we do that? We do it so we can close our eyes, roll over, and go back to sleep. We demand logic because logic is, well, it's safe.
It is a profound neurological reflex, honestly. When we encounter an auditory or sensory anomaly in a space where we expect absolute safety, like our bedroom, for example, our brain is thrust into a state of acute cognitive friction.
Right.
We have this primal survival instinct screaming that we might be in danger, but we also have a highly evolved prefrontal cortex that wants to conserve energy and avoid unnecessary panic.
So it's basically a tug of war in your head.
Exactly. So we default to the most benign explanation possible. We crave a return to our baseline. We use our rationality not necessarily to uncover the truth, but to soothe ourselves. We essentially convince ourselves that the dark is just empty space, completely devoid of threat.
Which brings us to the source text we are analyzing today for this deep dive. We were looking at a first-person account titled The Stranger in the Ceiling.
It's a heavy one.
Oh, it really is. Reading through this material, I found myself repeatedly looking over my shoulder because the true horror of this account isn't supernatural.
Right. No ghosts here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This isn't a ghost story about cursed burial grounds or, demonic possession. The terror here is rooted in absolute, grounding, undeniable physical reality.
Which makes it so much worse.
So much worse. We're going to meticulously track this narrator's psychological journey. We start with someone who is a rigid skeptic, someone entirely shielded by their own rationality, and we watch as that shield is just dismantled piece by piece.
Until they are left in a state of primal terror.
Yes. This text forces us to explore how our own brilliant analytical minds can sometimes completely betray our safety simply because we are so desperate to find a logical explanation for things that shouldn't be happening.
I mean, the conflict at the center of this text is the friction between the conscious, rational mind and the primitive, ingrained survival intuition that operates below our conscious awareness.
Yeah, that gut feeling.
Right. We live in a modern society where we are taught that being logical, being empirical, is the highest form of intelligence and safety. But in this specific scenario, logic is the very thing that makes the narrator incredibly vulnerable.
It's almost ironic.
It is. Their rationality creates a massive, dangerous blind spot. By demanding a logical explanation for every warning sign, they essentially silence their own internal alarm system.
To really grasp the magnitude of that blind spot, we have to look closely at the narrator's mindset before any of this even begins. The text opens with a very clear, deliberate declaration.
Yeah, they set the stage perfectly.
They really do. The narrator states, "I never believed in ghosts, not because I was brave, but because I always thought there was a logical explanation for everything."
Everything. Every sound, every shadow, every strange feeling.
Right. They had an answer ready. They are establishing their worldview right off the bat.
That distinction they make is vital, too. They aren't claiming to be a courageous warrior. They are claiming to be rational.
Right. It's not about being fearless.
Exactly. In psychological terms, logic is functioning here as a highly effective emotional defense mechanism. If you can explain a phenomenon, if you can categorize it and quantify it, you instantly strip it of its power to terrify you.
Because it's no longer unknown.
Precisely. When we encounter the unknown, our brain immediately searches its database for a familiar, non-threatening pattern to superimpose over the anomaly. The narrator has clearly spent their entire life perfecting this cognitive defense. They view their skepticism not just as a preference, but as an armor against the chaotic or the frightening.
And they bring that armor right into their new living situation, which is where the architectural reality of the story begins. The text tells us they moved into an old apartment.
Yes.
And right away, we get the first red flag, the catalyst for the entire nightmare.
The rent.
The rent was cheap. Specifically, the narrator says it was almost suspiciously cheap. But they immediately justify it. They explained that they were young, they needed a place to stay, and honestly, they didn't ask too many questions.
Which is a brilliant illustration of how situational necessity or, economic reality
Right.
forces human beings to override their natural threat detection systems.
Oh, absolutely.
When you are young, perhaps financially strapped and desperate for housing, a suspiciously cheap apartment doesn't register as a danger. It registers as a lifeline.
Right, you're just relieved to have a roof over your head.
Exactly. The narrator consciously recognizes the anomaly. They literally use the word suspiciously to describe the pricing, but they actively choose to suppress that instinct.
Because if they acknowledge it, they have to deal with it.
Right. Acknowledging the suspicion would require them to walk away from a deal they desperately need. They need the apartment to be safe and affordable, so they simply decide that it is.
I think everyone can relate to that feeling, though. It reminds me of buying a really cheap used car.
Oh, that's a perfect analogy.
You know the exact kind I mean. The car where the check engine light is already glowing orange on the dashboard when you take it for a test drive.
And you just pretend you don't see it.
Right. The seller is asking for almost nothing. And because the deal is so overwhelmingly in your favor financially, you willingly inherit the dysfunction. You almost expect things to be broken, strange, or unreliable.
Yeah, you bake that into your expectations.
Exactly. You willfully ignore the warning signs because your internal monologue says, well, I got what I paid for.
Yeah.
You rationalize the flaws before you even experience them. But doesn't relying on that kind of economic, circumstantial logic actually make us far less observant of our physical environment?
It undeniably does. It drastically lowers your baseline expectations for what constitutes normal in your environment.
How so?
Well, consider the alternative. If you were to move into a brand new, ultra-modern, luxury high-rise, your expectation is architectural perfection. In that environment, a single creaking floorboard, a draft of cold air, or a door that sticks would instantly alert you.
Right, because it's not supposed to be like that.
It violates the expectation of the space. But when you move into an old, dilapidated, suspiciously cheap apartment, your baseline for normal is already deeply compromised. You anticipate drafts.
You expect strange noises?
Exactly. You expect strange groaning noises from the plumbing. You assume the floorboards will pop and the doors will sag. Because the narrator consciously expected their new home to be imperfect and noisy, it made it incredibly easy for an external, malicious threat to blend right into the ambient background noise of the building.
So the building itself is like an accomplice.
Yes. The environment itself provided natural acoustic and visual camouflage.
And for the first few weeks, that camouflage works perfectly. The text is very clear on the timeline here. The narrator explicitly states, the first few weeks were normal, nothing unusual, no strange noises, no creepy experiences, everything felt fine.
They are completely settled in.
They are. Their rational armor is fully intact, and they feel a genuine sense of security. But then we hit the first crack in that armor.
Yeah.
And it happens in a way that bypasses logic entirely.
Yes, the 2:30 a.m. awakening.
Yes, this is such a visceral shift in the story. The text describes this moment vividly. It's 2:30 in the morning. The narrator wakes up abruptly. But the terrifying detail here is the absence of a trigger.
There was no reason for them to wake up.
None. There was no loud noise. There was no nightmare they were trying to escape. Nothing external woke them up. Instead, they describe waking up to a profound, inescapable feeling. The text says, like someone was watching me.
That is so deeply unsettling.
It is. They elaborate on it, asking the reader directly. You know that feeling when your body senses something before your mind does.
And if we look at the evolutionary biology behind that specific sensation, what the narrator is describing is not supernatural at all. It is an incredibly profound, ancient survival mechanism.
Really? Like hardwired into us?
Absolutely. Humans possess highly developed subconscious systems for threat detection. One of these is often referred to as the gaze detection system.
Wait, we have a system just for knowing if we're being looked at.
We do.
Yeah.
Even when our eyes are closed or when we are in the deepest stages of sleep, the lower brain, specifically the amygdala and the reticular activating system, remains fundamentally attuned to the environment.
That's wild.
The human nervous system can register microscopic shifts in air pressure, faint olfactory cues, or even the subtle infrasonic acoustics of another human breathing in a confined space.
So they were probably actually hearing or feeling someone breathe.
Very likely. The brain processes these minuscule data points and bypasses the sleeping prefrontal cortex entirely. It dumps a microdose of adrenaline into the bloodstream, which forces the body to wake up. The body is acting as a biological alarm system, signaling that a predator has breached the perimeter.
So the body is practically screaming, "Threat, wake up, you are not alone."
Yes, an immediate call to action.
And the narrator does open their eyes. They look around, but the room is dark. It's completely silent. Yet they explicitly state that something felt wrong. Very wrong. The physical intuition is blaring at maximum volume.
But their rational mind takes over.
It does. Let's look at their reaction. Do they jump out of bed? Do they grab a heavy object? Do they turn on all lights and systematically search the closets?
No, they don't do any of that.
No. The text says, "Eventually, I convinced myself I was overthinking, and I went back to sleep."
This moment is the tragic, ultimate triumph of their logical conditioning over their primitive, biological survival instinct. The narrator is trapped in a state of severe cognitive dissonance.
A total mental gridlock.
Exactly. Their autonomic nervous system is signaling immediate life-threatening danger, but their logical, conscious mind is scanning the dark, silent room and demanding empirical evidence to support the body's claim.
Show me the monster or I'm going back to sleep.
Precisely. Because they cannot see a threat, and because they hear no overt noise, the logical mind concludes the body must be malfunctioning. Because they have spent a lifetime training themselves to only believe in what can be logically proven, they completely dismiss their own internal alarm.
Which is just so dangerous.
It is. They literally force their body back into a vulnerable state of unconsciousness while actively in the presence of a predator.
It's terrifying. But if I'm being honest, it's also deeply relatable.
How so?
Well, I hear what you're saying about the biology of it, but think about the social conditioning we all undergo. We are taught not to be paranoid. We don't want to feel crazy.
That's true.
If I wake up in the dark and feel creeped out, my first thought isn't there's an intruder. My first thought is I had too much caffeine or I'm stressed about work. We constantly gaslight our own instincts.
We do. We prioritize comfort over caution.
But in this story, the denial can't last because the threat escalates. The very next morning, that vague, invisible feeling of being watched solidifies into physical evidence.
The first tangible clue.
Yeah. They wake up and walk into the kitchen only to find one of their cabinets wide open. And remember, they live alone. And they clearly remember closing it.
This is a crucial escalation. The threat has moved from the invisible realm of sensory intuition into the tangible physical environment.
Right into their personal space.
Yes. The physical perimeter of their space has been demonstrably altered. But pay attention to the narrator's internal monologue in response to this physical evidence. The text says, "At first I blamed myself. Maybe I forgot. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I wasn't paying attention."
Which, again, feels like a wild leap in logic to protect their sense of safety. I mean, imagine playing a high-stakes game of spot the difference with your own living space. You know the geometry of your own kitchen.
You know where everything goes.
Exactly. You know the physical lines of the room. When a wooden cabinet door is jutting out perpendicularly into the walking space, it is a glaring anomaly. But honestly, I have to push back on the idea that this is purely a failure of logic.
Go ahead.
If I find my cabinet open, my brain goes to, I'm losing my mind and my memory is failing, long before it ever goes to, there is a man secretly living in my walls who wants my cereal. Isn't assuming we made a simple mistake just the most basic form of self-preservation?
It is basic self-preservation, and that is exactly why it is so dangerous in this specific context. The narrator is relying on probability to manage their fear.
Probability.
Right.
Think about it. What is statistically, logically more probable? That you, a stressed, tired human being who recently moved, simply forgot to push a piece of wood shut? Or that an invisible, malicious entity is secretly navigating your apartment while you sleep?
Well, obviously the first one.
Right. The scientific principle of Occam's razor dictates that the simplest explanation is usually the correct one. The simplest explanation here is human error. And the narrator clings to this error like a life raft.
They need it to be human error.
They absolutely do. Their logic demands the simplest scenario because, I forgot, is a safe, manageable internal problem. Someone is in my apartment is an unmanageable external crisis that requires immediate, terrifying action.
Wow, yeah.
And what is truly chilling here is how the intruder entirely benefits from the narrator's psychological self-doubt. The intruder does not need to be a mastermind at covering their tracks because the narrator is actively doing the psychological labor of erasing the intruder's mistakes for them.
That is so creepy. The narrator is acting as an unwitting accomplice to their own haunting. They are doing the cover-up work for the predator.
And they keep doing it. They ignore that first cabinet. The text says days pass, and then it happens again, another morning, another open
Yeah.
cabinet. And still, they double down on blaming their own fatigue.
They're stretching their logic to the absolute limit.
They are stretching it as far as it can possibly stretch without snapping.
Hmm.
But eventually, the tension becomes too much. The logic has to break.
We reach the absolute tipping point of the narrative.
Yes. One evening, the narrator comes home from work. They walk into their kitchen, a space they left empty hours ago. And sitting right there, in the middle of the kitchen table, is a glass of water.
A glass of water.
A glass of water they never poured. And this utterly shatters them. They describe standing there completely frozen, staring at the glass. They say they were trying desperately to think of a logical explanation. Maybe they left it there before work.
But they can't.
No. The text reveals the internal breaking point. It says, but deep down, I knew I didn't.
We need to dissect why this specific object, something as simple as a glass of water, is the catalyst that finally shatters their denial. We were just discussing the open cabinets, right?
Yeah, the omission versus commission thing.
Exactly. Leaving a cabinet open is an act of omission. It is a failure to perform an action, failing to push the door shut. The human brain can very easily attribute an omission to memory loss, distraction, or fatigue. But a poured glass of water sitting on a table is an act of commission.
I want to pause on that distinction, actually, because it's huge. An act of omission is forgetting. An active commission is an active, deliberate, multi-step manipulation of the physical environment.
Precisely. Consider the mechanics involved. You do not accidentally, in a haze of morning fatigue, open a cupboard, extract the glass, carry it to the sink, turn on the faucet, fill the glass to a specific volume, turn off the water, carry the glass across the room, gently set it down on the center of the table, and then leave for work, all while wiping the entire sequence from your memory.
It's just not possible.
It requires a chain of deliberate physical intentions. An open cabinet is merely a void, a lack of action. But a poured glass of water is a physical presence. It is undeniable empirical proof of a secondary active agency operating within the closed boundaries of the apartment.
This is where the story shifts from unsettling to psychologically devastating. Because a glass of water is, in any normal context, the most mundane, harmless object in the human experience.
Completely mundane.
But placed in the wrong context, it becomes a weapon of absolute psychological terror. Let me offer an analogy here.
Sure.
Imagine you are an astronaut. You have just landed on the moon. You step out of the lander. You are looking out over the untouched, gray, desolate landscape of a dead world. And right there, 3 feet away from your ship, you see a fresh, perfectly formed human footprint in the dust.
Oh, that's a brilliant comparison.
And it's a footprint that does not match your boots. Now, the footprint itself cannot hurt you. It has no teeth, no weapon. But the sheer existence of it instantly destroys your entire understanding of reality, physics, and your place in the universe.
That analogy perfectly captures the paradigm shift the narrator experiences. The footprint on the moon proves you are not alone in an environment where being alone is the only mathematically and logically permissible reality.
Right.
The glass of water performs the exact same function in the narrator's apartment. It fundamentally breaks the laws of the reality they have constructed. And pay close attention to the physiological response the text describes in that moment.
The freeze response.
Yes. The narrator states they stood frozen. They describe feeling real fear, the kind that sits in your chest, the kind that makes your heart beat louder than normal.
They aren't just scared like watching a scary movie. They're having a massive, involuntary neurochemical reaction.
Because this is the exact microsecond their lifelong armor of rationality shatters completely. The text explicitly highlights the internal war happening in their brain. Trying to think of a logical explanation, but deep down, I knew.
Their brain is short-circuiting.
The narrator's conscious mind is frantically spinning its gears, desperately trying to invent an impossible scenario where they poured the water and developed amnesia. But the primal intuition, that exact same survival instinct they forcefully suppressed at 2:30 a.m., has finally overpowered the intellect.
It's like the body saying, I told you so.
Exactly. The intuition has been validated by irrefutable physical evidence. The threat is no longer an ambiguous feeling in the dark. It is a concrete fact sitting on the table. And the body responds by flooding the system with cortisol and adrenaline, locking them into a paralyzed state of prey, facing a predator.
And once the brain finally accepts that the threat is real, the illusion of safety vanishes entirely. The senses become hyper-tuned to danger.
They're on high alert.
Very much so. The text notes they barely slept that night. They're lying awake, listening. And then, around 3 a.m., the physical evidence escalates. It moves from a stationary object to a terrifying auditory confirmation of movement.
The footsteps from above.
Yes. Around 3 a.m., in the dead of night, the narrator hears footsteps. But the text is very deliberate in its description. These aren't just the muffled sounds of someone walking. They are described specifically as slow and heavy, and they're coming from the ceiling.
Which introduces the spatial paradox.
Right. Here is the spatial paradox that escalates this from a creepy anecdote into a surreal nightmare. The narrator lives on the top floor of the building.
The architectural detail of the top floor is structurally vital to the terror of the sequence. By placing the narrator on the absolute highest level of the building, the physical environment forces their mind into a brutal binary corner.
Because there shouldn't be anyone up there.
There can't be anyone up there.
Yeah.
If you clearly hear heavy footsteps directly above your head, and you know for a fact there is no floor above you, your logic is trapped. You are forced to accept one of two impossible realities.
What are they?
Option A. You must completely abandon your lifelong rationality and accept the existence of the supernatural, that a ghost or an ethereal entity is walking on thin air above your ceiling.
Which they don't want to do.
No. Option B. You must accept a horrific, impossible physical reality that a solid, heavy human mass is actively moving in a physical space that, according to your understanding of the building, does not exist.
There is no middle ground anymore. The logic is entirely broken. But I want to focus on the cadence of those footsteps for a second.
The pacing.
Yes, the pacing. The text emphasizes that the footsteps go back and forth, and they continue for nearly 10 minutes.
That's a long time to pace.
It is. If an intruder were simply trying to cross a roof to escape or, trying to sneak into an adjacent window, they would move quickly, lightly, and purposefully to get from point A to point B. But pacing, walking slowly back and forth for 10 continuous minutes.
Pacing changes the entire psychological profile of the threat.
How so?
Well, pacing implies boredom, deep thought, or profound comfort. It implies ownership of the space. Whoever, or whatever, is making those slow, heavy sounds is clearly not worried about being heard by the person below them.
They aren't trying to hide.
Not at all. They're not in a rush. They are comfortably, casually occupying the negative space above the narrator's bed. It demonstrates a terrifying level of entitlement to the environment. The predator feels completely secure in their domain.
It is psychological torture. The narrator is forced to lie there in the dark, listening to this heavy pacing for 10 agonizing minutes, and then, just as suddenly as it started, complete silence.
The absence of sound becomes just as scary.
Yeah. So the next day, the narrator does what almost any modern person does when their physical sanctuary is violated. They try to regain a sense of control by outsourcing their vigilance to technology.
The camera.
They go out and buy a small security camera. The text explicitly states they told themselves it was just for peace of mind. But then they admit the truth. Honestly, I was terrified.
The introduction of the security camera is another fascinating attempt to use logic and technology as a shield against the unknown.
Right, because a camera doesn't lie.
Exactly. The camera is essentially a modern digital manifestation of the rational, objective mind. A camera doesn't have a nervous system, It doesn't feel fear, it doesn't get paranoid, and it doesn't hallucinate. It only records empirical light and shadow.
So they're looking for proof that they are alone.
Yes. The narrator is desperately hoping the camera will record 8 hours of an empty room, thereby providing mathematical, unassailable proof that they are alone, allowing them to finally dismiss their fear. It is a plea for a return to the baseline of safety.
But the camera completely fails to provide that peace. Instead, it provides the exact opposite. It validates the nightmare.
The footage.
Yeah, the footage. They face the camera toward the kitchen, the sight of the open cabinets and the glass of water. They go to sleep. The next morning, they check the digital footage. At first, it's exactly what they wanted. Hours and hours of nothing, just a dark, static room.
Building a false sense of security.
But then, the timestamp hits exactly 3:17 a.m. And what happens next is described with such subtle, horrifying restraint. The camera doesn't capture a man in a ski mask walking into the middle of the room.
It's much more subtle than that.
Instead, the camera itself moves. The text says it wasn't much, just a tiny shift, like someone touched it.
That tiny mechanical shift represents a masterful, terrifying escalation of the invasion. Let's analyze the psychological implications of that specific movement.
Let's do it.
Up until this moment, the intruder has only interacted with objects that belong to the narrator's daily routine, the cabinets, the drinking glass. But the camera is an object explicitly introduced into the environment for the sole purpose of observing the intruder.
It's a new variable.
By reaching out and physically manipulating the camera lens, the intruder is demonstrating a profound level of situational awareness. They instantly recognize the foreign object in the room, they understand its function, and they are asserting absolute dominance over the instrument of observation.
Wait, I want to pause on that physical touch because the implications are staggering. Up to this point, a desperate mind could still try to argue that maybe the entity is ambient or paranormal. A ghost.
But a ghost doesn't adjust a camera.
Exactly. Physically touching the plastic casing of a camera. That's not just proving physical reality. That is ego. That is the intruder looking directly into the lens and saying, I see you watching me. It shifts the dynamic entirely. The intruder isn't just hiding anymore. They are taunting the victim.
Exactly. It proves beyond any shadow of a doubt that the entity is physical, highly intelligent, and acutely aware of the narrator's attempts to trap or identify it. You cannot capture a ghost's fingerprint, but a physical biological mass must exert kinetic energy to shift the angle of a camera lens.
And right after that tiny physical shift, the camera finally captures a visual. But again, it's not a clear picture. The narrator notices a shadow moving near the absolute edge of the frame.
Just a shadow.
The text describes it as happening just for a second. Too fast to identify, too dark to understand. The narrator says they literally couldn't breathe watching it. Now, logic would dictate that seeing a clear, illuminated face of the intruder would be the most useful, terrifying evidence.
From a practical standpoint, yes.
But why does seeing just a fleeting, formless, dark shadow feel infinitely more horrifying than seeing a defined face?
Because a shadow represents the purest silhouette of the unknown. Human psychology relies heavily on categorization. If you see a clear face on that footage, even the face of a hardened, dangerous criminal, your brain immediately goes to work categorizing the threat.
Right, you make them human.
You assess their age, their physical build, their gender, their emotional state. The threat becomes a known, quantifiable variable. You can give a description to the police. But a fast-moving, unidentifiable shadow leaves a profound visual and cognitive void.
And we hate voids.
We do. And the human imagination abhors a void. When presented with the unknown, our minds will rush in to fill that darkness with our absolute worst, most personalized fears. A shadow has no boundaries, no defined weaknesses.
That makes total sense.
Furthermore, the fact that they only caught a fleeting shadow implies that the intruder is highly skilled at evasion. They are intentionally operating on the extreme periphery of the narrator's vision and technology, which makes them appear almost omnipotent within the confined space of the apartment.
It's the absolute terror of the unseen predator, the realization that you are completely, hopelessly outmatched in your own territory. So, armed with undeniable digital proof that the threat is real, physical, and actively maneuvering around them, the narrator's logic shield is completely obliterated.
There is no more denying it.
They can no longer rationalize a physically manipulated camera and a shadowy figure at 3:47 a.m. They are forced to admit defeat and seek outside intervention. And this leads to what I consider the absolute fulcrum of the entire story. The conversation that changes the reality of the situation forever. They pick up the phone and call their landlord.
This interaction is where the structural horror of the narrative is fully unveiled. Everything pivots on the landlord's reaction.
Right. Because in a normal world, if you call your landlord and say, I have camera footage of someone in my apartment, you expect shock. You expect them to say, what? A break-in? Did you call the police? Are you safe?
You expect alarm.
But instead, the text emphasizes that the landlord's reaction was not surprise. The reaction was silence. The narrator explicitly calls it a long silence.
That silence is perhaps the heaviest moment in the text. We have to analyze exactly what is happening in the landlord's cognitive process during those few seconds of dead air.
What's going through their mind?
The narrator has just described an impossible scenario. Heavy footsteps coming from the ceiling of a top-floor apartment. The landlord, unlike the young tenant, possesses the complete architectural blueprint of the building in their mind. They know the history of the structure.
They know the secrets of the building.
Exactly. During that long silence, the landlord is putting the puzzle pieces together. They are experiencing a sudden, nauseating realization of the building's physical vulnerability. That silence is the sound of the landlord's own logic clicking into place, arriving at a conclusion so incredibly disturbing that it literally paralyzes their vocal cords.
The asymmetry of knowledge between those two people on the phone is terrifying. The landlord suddenly knows a dark, structural secret about the space the narrator is sleeping in. And then, finally, the landlord breaks the silence.
With one question.
They ask a single question. A question the narrator says they will never forget for the rest of their life.
Okay.
Have you checked the attic access?
Which is a question that instantly shatters the narrator's understanding of their own world.
Completely. The narrator replies that they didn't even know there was an attic, because apparently there was a small hidden attic space located directly above the apartment, a space they had never noticed, never been told about, and never explored.
The hidden geography.
Think about the psychology of renting an apartment. When you move into a space, you assume the drywall, the floorboards, and the ceiling are the absolute impenetrable boundaries of your world. You believe you know the geometry of your safe zone.
You are describing the concept of architectural psychology and the shock of hidden geography. We build our fundamental psychological concept of home based entirely on the visible perimeter.
Right, now we can see.
Our baseline sense of safety is entirely dependent on knowing and controlling every single entry and exit point. We lock the deadbolt on the front door, we check the latches on the windows, and our brain tells us the perimeter is secure, we are safe.
And the attic ruins that.
The sudden revelation of a hidden attic access completely annihilates that secure perimeter. It means the mental map the narrator had drawn of their own sanctuary was fundamentally flawed and compromised from the very first day they moved in. There was a massive, gaping blind spot the size of their entire ceiling.
It is the ultimate violation of sanctuary. So the landlord arrives later that same day. They locate the hidden access panel, they climb up into the dark space together, and they discover what the source text calls something that still haunts me.
Because it wasn't empty.
Because they don't just find an empty, dusty crawl space with some old insulation. They find a living environment. They find a mattress, empty food containers, bottled water, old clothes.
Let's analyze the profound implication of those specific artifacts. This collection of items rules out a transient crime.
It wasn't a quick break-in.
No. This wasn't a burglar who broke in, hid from passing police sirens for a few hours, and then fled into the night. A mattress, a stockpile of food and water, and clothing are the unmistakable artifacts of domesticity. They indicate a sustained parasitic living situation.
A parasite, yeah, that's exactly what it is.
This is a well-documented, though incredibly rare and terrifying phenomenon, often referred to in urban survival culture as frogging, where a person secretly lives in the occupied home of another person, often in attics, crawl spaces, or basements, moving around only when the primary resident is asleep or away.
The text spells out the reality of this with brutal, terrifying clarity. Someone had been living there for weeks, maybe months, watching, listening, waiting, while I slept below.
The timeline is the worst part.
I want to really sit with the timeline horror of this, because it is almost too much for the brain to process. It is one thing to suffer a home invasion. If someone kicks down your front door at midnight, it is a chaotic, violent, terrifying trauma. But it is an immediate, localized, discrete event. It happens, and then it is over.
Yes, a clear beginning and end.
It is an entirely different, almost incomprehensible universe of horror to retroactively realize that the invasion actually happened weeks ago. The perimeter of your home was breached before you even finished unpacking your boxes. The intruder hasn't just been a passing nightmare, they have been your silent, constant roommate.
The psychological devastation of that retroactive realization cannot be overstated. Think about the profound vulnerability of human sleep. Think about the private conversations you have in your home, the moments of unguarded emotion, the mundane, intimate routines of daily life.
Like walking around in a towel after a shower.
Exactly, singing to yourself, crying. The narrator is suddenly forced to realize that every single private, isolated moment they believed they had experienced in that apartment was actually a shared voyeuristic experience. They were being observed, monitored, and learned by a completely unknown, malignant entity resting just inches above their head. The ceiling wasn't a barrier, it was a viewing screen.
And in that moment of discovery in the attic, suddenly every single mystery in the story is instantly, flawlessly solved by cold, hard logic.
It all comes together.
Why did they wake up at 2:30 a.m. with the visceral feeling of being watched? Because they were literally being watched, likely through a crack in the floorboards or a vent. Why were the kitchen cabinets mysteriously open in the morning? Because the person living in the ceiling was climbing down while the narrator slept to steal their food.
And the glass of water.
The glass of water on the table. The intruder poured it, took a drink, and made a rare, careless mistake by leaving it behind before scurrying back up to the attic. The heavy top-floor footsteps. It was a physical, heavy human being pacing back and forth on the wooden joists of the attic.
The camera shifting at 3.17 a.m.
The intruder climbed down, noticed the glowing lens of the new camera, and physically adjusted its angle to avoid being caught on tape while they raided the kitchen. The logic the narrator so desperately craved at the beginning of the story has been perfectly restored.
Yes, the irony here is incredibly dark and profound. Every anomaly has a completely rational explanation. All the pieces fit together mathematically. The narrator demanded a logical explanation, and the universe provided one.
But it was the worst possible explanation.
But the logical explanation turns out to be infinitely worse and vastly more dangerous than any supernatural ghost story. A ghost is an ethereal concept, you know. It exists outside the physical bounds of human reality. You cannot arrest a ghost, but a ghost also cannot wield a physical weapon against you.
Right.
But a living, breathing human being occupying the dead space in your ceiling, that is an active, premeditated, malignant invasion of your physical reality by an apex predator.
Which brings us to the grim, unresolved reality of the aftermath. Because normally in a mystery or a thriller, once the mystery is solved and the threat is identified, the protagonist feels a sense of relief. The monster is unmasked.
But not here.
But here, the narrator is left with an agonizing, permanent lack of closure. They call the police. The police search the apartment and the attic, but they find no one.
They vanished.
Whoever it was, the text states, disappeared without a single trace. No fingerprints were left behind. No discarded identification. Nothing.
This introduces the enduring terror of the vanishing act. The unknown variable in this equation has not been eliminated. It has simply been displaced.
What do you mean by displaced?
By disappearing so cleanly, without leaving any identifying markers, the intruder maintains all of their psychological power over the victim. The police cannot offer the narrator any answers. They can't tell them who the person was, why they specifically chose that apartment, or, most terrifyingly, where they went after they fled.
Right. Did they just move to the next town? Or did they just move into the attic of the building across the street?
Yeah.
Will they come back? Do they have a spare key hidden somewhere?
Exactly. The complete lack of fingerprints or ID means the threat remains completely faceless and therefore mentally omnipresent. The intruder could be anyone. It could be the person passing the narrator on the sidewalk. It could be the person standing behind them in line at the grocery store.
You would never know.
The highly specific, localized trauma of the apartment invasion metastasizes into a permanent ambient fear of the unknown other in society.
And the source text explicitly outlines how this profound trauma fundamentally shifted the narrator's entire philosophy on fear and reality. They write, sometimes the most terrifying stories are about ghosts. They're about people. Because ghosts might not be real, but evil people certainly are.
It's a complete paradigm shift.
It is a complete 180-degree turn from the opening sentences of the story. They started out using their logic to stubbornly disprove ghosts because they wanted to feel safe in the dark. They end the story realizing that logic absolutely proves the existence of real flesh-and-blood human predators. And that is a far, far more dangerous and exhausting reality to live in.
It represents a total, irreversible loss of innocence. The narrator's worldview has been permanently fractured. The shield of logic they relied on for comfort has been repurposed. It no longer protects them from imaginary supernatural monsters. Instead, it constantly, rigorously reminds them of the very real, very human monsters that exist in the world.
It's devastating.
And we see the devastating physical manifestation of this lasting psychological trauma in the very final lines of the text.
We do. The final lines are haunting. They write, and that's why, even now, years later, I still lock every door before I sleep, every single night, because some fears never leave you, and some stories stay with you forever. The phrasing there is critical to understanding their current state. They say they still lock every door.
Every door.
Not just the front door leading to the street, the internal doors, the bathroom door, the closet door, and most importantly, the bedroom door.
That specific detail is heartbreaking, and it speaks volumes about the psychology of trauma survivors. In psychology, we talk about a concept called a permanent baseline shift.
Okay, what does that mean exactly?
The narrator's baseline of safety will never return to what it was before they moved into that apartment. That detail about locking the internal doors tells us that their fundamental concept of a home as a safe sanctuary has been permanently destroyed.
Right, the front door isn't enough anymore.
The heavy deadbolt on the front door is no longer perceived as a sufficient barrier against the dangers of the outside world. The only physical space they can even attempt to control, the only space where they can momentarily lower their guard to sleep, is the immediate locked perimeter of their bed. The act of locking that internal bedroom door every single night is a ritualistic, physical acknowledgement of their trauma.
So after tracking this entire harrowing journey, I want to throw a philosophical question at you based on this text. The narrator fiercely wanted a logical explanation for the bumps in the night. They stubbornly, almost arrogantly, demanded that the world make rational sense.
And they got it.
And they got exactly what they asked for. But that rational truth broke them completely.
Well,
Looking at how they live now, locking internal doors years later, is it possible that believing in ghosts, believing in the supernatural is actually a highly effective, comforting coping mechanism compared to facing the cold, hard reality of human predators?
I think the text makes a compelling argument for exactly that. When things go bump in the night, blaming a ghost is almost a psychological way of absolving humanity of its darkness.
That's a fascinating way to put it.
A ghost is an ethereal echo of the past, right? It doesn't have a beating heart, it doesn't feel hunger, it doesn't possess malicious intent in a biological sense, and it certainly doesn't hold a knife. Furthermore, you cannot physically lock a door against a ghost, so believing in a haunting allows for a strained kind of passive surrender.
You just accept the spooky vibe.
You simply accept the spooky environment, but you can lock a door against a living person. The terrifying truth this story exposes is that human evil is real, it is tangible, and it is entirely capable of living quietly and patiently in the walls and ceilings of our most intimate, vulnerable spaces.
It's too real.
Believing in a supernatural haunting is a convenient way for the human brain to avoid processing the horrifying statistical reality that another human being might be watching you sleep. The narrator's locked bedroom door is a daily physical concession that the monsters are indeed real, and the terrifying part is that they look exactly like us.
It is a truly chilling evolution to witness. We started this deep dive looking at a narrator who was comfortably wrapped in the false security of their own logic, actively ignoring the blaring biological warnings of their own physical intuition. We meticulously tracked how that over-reliance on rationalization blinded them to an escalating physical threat in their environment, right up to the horrifying, impossible reality of a stranger quietly occupying the hidden architecture directly above their bed.
It's a journey from skepticism to survival.
The true, lasting horror of this source text, as we've uncovered today, isn't some campfire story about a supernatural haunting. It is the deep, profound, and entirely realistic violation of our most private sanctuaries by ordinary, flesh-and-blood human beings.
And this is the moment where the lessons of this text demand that we turn the mirror back on you, the listener.
Yes, absolutely.
Because this isn't just a story about one person in an old apartment. It's a study of how we all navigate the spaces we assume are safe. Think about the environments you inhabit daily. The next time you are lying in your bed in the dead of night and you hear that floorboard creak in the hallway, or you notice a sudden, unexplainable draft of cold air, what will your reaction be?
Will you rationalize it?
Will your highly trained, logical mind immediately jump in to soothe you, telling you it's just the house settling or the wind outside? Or will you remember the architecture of this deep dive? Will you pause, listen to that sudden, inexplicable spike in your heart rate, and wonder if your primitive body knows something your rational mind is desperately refusing to accept?
And I will leave you with this final, lingering thought to mull over when you go home tonight. The narrator in our source material survived their ordeal physically, but their reality was fractured forever. They now ritualistically lock their internal bedroom door every single night just to keep the rest of the world and the rest of their own house out.
Every single night.
But I want you to think about the specific physical architecture of your own home right now. Think about the layout of your hallways, the size of your air vents, the depth of your crawl spaces, the dark corners of your closets, and the space between your ceiling and your roof. When you slide the lock shut on your bedroom door tonight, how can you be absolutely 100% sure you aren't just locking yourself in with whatever is already quietly hiding inside?